Good evening. I'd like to call the meeting to order and welcome you all to the Monday, November 24th, 2017 regular meeting of the Falls Church City Council. We are delighted you're all here with us this evening. Would ask that you please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Madam Clerk, will you call roll, please?
Yes. Ms. Conley?
Here.
Mr. Duncan?
Here.
Ms. Hardy?
Here.
Ms. Oliver?
Here.
Mr. Snyder?
Here.
Mr. Z?
Here.
Mayor Tarter?
Here.
Thank you, Council.
Thank you. Do we have a motion to adopt a meeting agenda?
Move to adopt the meeting agenda.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The ayes have it. Thank you all for coming out this evening. Before we get to the main course, we have a few proclamations and presentations. So why don't we go ahead and get started with those. Our first is a proclamation declaring April 24th through 28th as Community Development Block Grant Week. And that's Vice Mayor Conley is going to go ahead and read that proclamation.
Whereas the Community Development Block Grant, CDBG program, has operated since 1975 to provide local governments with the resources required to meet the needs of persons with low and moderate incomes. And whereas CDBG funds are used by thousands to meet nationwide neighborhood and human services needs. And whereas the CDBG program has helped more than 133 city families and individuals this year receive early childhood education, emergency rental assistance, transitional housing, tenant consulting, and needed property enhancements. And whereas the City of Falls Church, Virginia, and other local governments have clearly demonstrated the capacity to administer and customize the CDBG program to identify, prioritize, and resolve pressing local problems, such as the shortage of affordable housing, neighborhood and human services needs, and physical redevelopment. And whereas the City of Falls Church has several partners in the CDBG program, including Falls Church City Public Schools, Falls Church Community Services Council, Homestretch Inc., Casa de Northern Virginia, and the Falls Church Housing Corporation, Inc.
Now, therefore, I, David Tarter, Mayor of the City of Falls Church, Virginia, do hereby proclaim the week of April 24th through 28th, 2017, as Community Development Week in the City of Falls Church, Virginia, and urge all residents to join us in recognizing the Community Development Block Grant Program and the important role it plays in our community. Have anyone to receive this proclamation? Oh, welcome. Come on forward. Is there anything you'd like to say beforehand? Any comments or statement you'd like to make? You're welcome to.
Thank you so much. I'm here with Brenda, new housing member.
Hello, my name is Brenda Heffernan. I'm the newest member of the City of Falls Church Housing Commission. Thank you for having us tonight.
Thank you so much. I just want to say that CDBG projects and money are really important in this city for all the services that we provide. And I thank you for your support, basically. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you for the good work you do. Why don't you come forward and we can go ahead and give this proclamation directly to you all. Okay, our next proclamation is declaring April as Fair Housing Month. Ms. Oliver, are you going to handle this one?
Whereas fair housing has been the law of the land since 1968, and whereas the city's Fair Housing Ordinance prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, marital status, national origin, sex, elderliness, familiar status, or handicap. And whereas we are proud of the cultural enrichment brought to our community from people across the globe and those of all races, religions, ethnicities, and ages.
Now therefore, I, David Tarter, Mayor of the City of Falls Church, Virginia, do hereby proclaim the month of April 2017 as Fair Housing Month in the City of Falls Church and call upon all citizens to support the city's total commitment to fair housing for all of our citizens. Is there anyone to receive this proclamation? Oh, long time no see.
Oh,
Welcome
yes,
back.
We're back. We're back at the City of Falls Church Housing Commission. We would like to invite all council members to attend the Fair Housing Training for property managers that will be held this Friday from 10 a.m. to 12 noon in the Dogwood Room. Dana Lewis asked me to just give you a little bit of background. I'm as you know, the newest member to the Falls Church City Housing Commission. I am an attorney with the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors, and part of my work involves writing curriculum and actually teaching on fair housing. So I will not be doing this training, but I will be attending to observe and hope that you can make it as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Why don't you come on up again? We'll give you a second one. Thank you all very much, and thank you for your service to our community. Welcome on board the Housing Commission. All right, we've got one more proclamation that is declaring May 4th as Children's Mental Health Awareness Day, and I believe Mr. Snyder's going to go ahead and handle this.
Thanks a lot. Whereas the well-being of children has a profound, immediate, and lasting impact on our community, yet 1 in 5 children has a diagnosable mental health condition. Nearly half of teens will have such a condition at some point. And whereas only half of children and youth are estimated to receive needed treatment due to multiple barriers that may prevent families from assessing timely and appropriate behavioral health services, including stigma, high costs, and a lack of providers that accept Medicaid and insurance. And whereas Falls Church City Public Schools, Fairfax County agencies, Fairfax County Public Schools, nonprofit agencies, family and consumer organizations are together implementing a multi-year children's behavioral health system of care blueprint to address barriers to assessing services through coordinating prevention, early intervention, and intensive treatment services. And whereas by offering awareness and training opportunities such as mental health first aid, these partners are helping to reduce the stigma associated with mental health conditions and to increase help-seeking behaviors among our youth and families. And whereas Community Services Board, same-day assessment and intensive care coordination, and family engagement in the Department of Family Services have resulted in more accessible services and a 59% reduction in the number of youth requiring long-term residential treatment over the past 6 years. And whereas new efforts such as the National Alliance on Mental Illness, Northern Virginia's Parent Support Partners, and System of Care short-term behavioral health services help families access quality mental health services. And whereas the U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has declared May 4 to be National Children's Mental Health Awareness Day.
Now, therefore, I, David Tarter, Mayor of the City of Falls Church, Virginia, do hereby proclaim May 4th, 2017 as Children's Mental Health Awareness Day in the City of Falls Church, and urge all citizens to recognize that mental health in childhood means reaching development and emotional milestones, learning healthy social skills, and effectively coping with problems and declare, as a community, we will support all youth to attain their optimal level of emotional, psychological, and social well-being. Do we have it? Looks like Ms. Vincent, you're here to receive this proclamation?
I am. Good evening,
Good evening.
Mayor, members of council. I'm Nancy Vincent, Director of the Department of Human Services. And there are two folks here who are here to receive the proclamation. The first is Craig Cheney, who chairs the Human Services Advisory Council. And second, you'll hear from Jim Gillespie, who is the Director of the Systems of Care for Fairfax County.
Okay, welcome to you both, Mr. Cheney.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And as Mr. Snyder noted in the proclamation, there's some pretty sobering statistics around what we're here to honor tonight or recognize tonight. Half of the adult mental illness begins before the age of 14. More than 40% of youths aged 13 to 17 have experienced a behavioral health problem by the time they reach 7th grade. In addition, suicide is the third leading cause of death among youths aged 15 to 24. That alone ought to give us importance for why we're here this evening. Compared to all other chronic health conditions, mental disorders produce the greatest disability impact within this age group, and youth transitioning into adulthood have some of the highest rates of alcohol and substance abuse. The city partners with Fairfax County to provide services to children and youth in the city. Through the Community Services Fund, the city supports the work of PRS Crisis Link, a 24-hour phone and text hotline for crisis intervention, suicide prevention, information, and referrals. Let it be our goal that we continue to support initiatives to reduce and respond to mental health in our youth. And we really, really appreciate your support this evening in this proclamation. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Gillespie.
Good evening, Mayor Tarter, members of the council. Thank you for the invitation to come, and thank you for the proclamation. I believe my remarks follow directly on Craig's. I wanted to highlight just a couple of the really positive developments going on in our community around this issue. Following up on Craig's mentioning of the Crisis Link service, Crisis Link in the past year and a half has set up a new crisis text line where youth primarily and young adults who prefer to text rather than use the phone can text in their problems and issues, and it has been tremendously successful. It's a national model. The Fairfax Falls Church Community Services Board now has same-day assessment services for children and youth at its Merrifield Center. That's been very successful. And children and youth who are seen at Merrifield, their families then have the choice. If it's quicker for them to get their ongoing treatment at Merrifield, they can do that, or they can be scheduled for an appointment at a center closer to their home. So that's been a real positive development. And lastly, as the proclamation mentioned, our Northern Virginia chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness has a contract with the county using federal grant funds to be able to provide paraprofessional family support partners. These folks, these family support partners are trained parents of youth or young adults who have had mental health issues, and these parents are really savvy on how to navigate the system to access services. They are matched with parents who are struggling to get services for their children with mental health issues. This is a nationally recognized model, and hundreds of children and youth in Fairfax Falls Church and the city of Fairfax will be able to be served for the next 3.5 years. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your service, all of your service to our community. Would you like to come forward and get the proclamation? Okay, I understand we have at least one one oath of office to administer. There you go. Stay on up here. Just get a seat over there. You will.
I state your name. Solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that I will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon me as a member of the Human Services Advisory Council, according to the best of my ability, so help me God. Thank you. And I just-
Thank you very much. Okay, are there any other oaths of office to administer, Madam Clerk?
I think that was it. Thank you.
All right, sounds good. Let's move on to receipt of public comment. Why don't we start with the written comments, a summary of the written comments?
We got a number of comments about budget and CIP. The following wrote, in opposition to a tax increase for capital reserves, Frederick Foss, 119 East Jefferson Street, Christina New, 413 Lincoln Avenue. She also asked for an audit of school and city operations. John Measley, Karen Sharp of 408 West Street, suggested using 30-year level payment bonds for all projects. Bob Lajeunesse of 409 South Virginia Avenue wrote to agree with Mr. Sharp. The following wrote in support of a tax increase for capital reserves. Andy Rankin, 345 Little Falls Street. Diane Bartley, she also supports fully funding the original school and city budgets. Andrew Miller, Susan Dimmock, 100 Buxton Road. Pamela A. Saunders. Laura Barrell and David Barrell of 209 Tyson Drive, and Allison Brown and Gardner Humphreys of 706 Poplar Drive wrote in support of a tax increase, and they also support an additional $137,000 in the school budget supported by a tax increase. The following wrote in support of moving forward with the library project: Sally Phillips, 200 North Maple Avenue, David Braun, 200 North Maple Avenue, Peter Markram, Joanne Lee of 200 North Maple Avenue, Gail Wadsworth of 200 North Maple Avenue, Ellen Salisbury, Vipus sent a letter also, Madeline B. Kafruni, 426 Park Avenue, and Jeffrey Tarbert, 426 Park Avenue, also wrote about the library. As for school projects, Trish Horowitz of 106 North Cherry Street wrote to express frustration with the Mount Daniel project and provided comments on other school projects. The cottage development on Railroad Avenue, Bethany and Daniel Henderson forwarded their concerns about the project, although they like the concept of cottages at the location. And then regarding the Broad and Washington project, David Mead of 208 Midvale Street wrote in support of the project, and all of those comments are attached.
Thank you very much. All right, we're going to move on to receipt of public comments. At the present, I have 3 speaker slips. Anyone else is welcome to submit a speaker slip. You can either speak now or when the item you're here to speak about comes up, which I imagine will happen fairly shortly, but you're welcome again to speak now. We ask that you state your name for the record, that you state your address, and you keep your comments to 3 minutes. So right now, again, I have 3 speakers. I'm going to go ahead and start with the first speaker. That's Ruth Rogers. Ms. Rogers, welcome. Do you have another meeting to go to? Is that what I heard? Okay.
I know you've received the VPUS letter and was mentioned, and we thank you for your comments in response, but that's not why I'm talking. I am on my way to my book club meeting, and the 12 women of my book club are very interested in the library, and so we wanted to have somebody speak about that. A long time ago, about this time of year, as the Planning Commission was considering its recommendations to Council on the Capital Improvements Program, the Assistant City Manager and the library staff and the Library Advisory Board came before the Commission, and they presented their honest and very well-researched requests for renovations and additions to the Mary Ryle Stiles Library. They requested, as you may remember, $34 million for a major renovation that would also include much-needed updates to the library building for ADA compliance and library patrons' safety and comfort, as well as community meeting rooms and additional parking. Now, the Planning Commission, in its wisdom, told the library representatives that practically speaking, $34 million wasn't going to go anywhere. We couldn't put it in the CIP for the foreseeable future and get it approved by City Council. We told them school renovations at TJ, Mount Daniel, and way in the future, a $50 million, that sounded an awful lot to us at that time, placeholder for George Mason renovations. The library went back to the drawing board, and they came back with fewer additions, lesser renovations, and a much lesser number. A year later, they came back with an even lesser number. Finally, in 2016, that number was approved by the Planning Commission. The City Council, and in a public referendum, approved decisively by more than 2/3 of Falls Church City voters. It was well known then that there would be a tax implication connected to this vote surrounding the library renovation. It's time for the library to begin renovating its space for the safety of its patrons, for the assistance it gives our students, be compliant for our disabled citizens, and for the many other wonderful library services it provides to the citizens of Falls Church, from preschoolers to senior citizens. I beg you not to overlook the will of the citizens by removing or downgrading the $8.4 million that has been approved for the library in this budget cycle. I thank you, and I can pretty much assure you that members of all the other book clubs in this city will be supporting that too. I neglected to say, my name is Ruth Rogers, 105 Buxton Road. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Our next speaker is Mr. Benton. Nick Benton, come on down. Followed by Mr. Sharp.
I'm Nick Benton, 400 James Court. I just rise to call your attention to what I believe is an omission in your fair housing policy statement. I'm almost positive that about a half a dozen or a dozen years ago, sexual orientation was added to the list of protected classes for fair housing in Falls Church.
Thank you very much. Mr. Shields, can you look into that? Or do you know the answer to that? Okay, great. Thank you very much. I think we'd all like to know the answer to that question. Yes, Ms. Hardy?
Well, and I'm not sure about housing policy or the history of that. However, I did provide an opinion last year that it's prohibitive for you to have an ordinance, and it has been, the law may be changing on that. We're continuing to look at it. But under Dillon's rule, you've not been permitted in the past to prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation. However, there are places that have it in certain policies that are not ordinances, and I don't know whether that was ever put into your policy.
Can you take a look at that, both of you all, and report back to us?
I will. Ms. Heffernan, the new member of the Housing Commission who was here tonight, has been asking about it, and we are setting up a meeting and going to discuss that, what they want to do and what we can do, and see what we can develop on that.
And you're referring to Dillon's rule, in other words, that the state has prohibited localities to some extent from actually
Yes.
prohibiting discrimination on the basis of
Yes, the city's permitted by state law to prohibit discrimination on some bases. Sexual orientation is not one of those, and the Virginia Supreme Court and the Attorney General have generally held that that means that it's not an allowable provision for us to have in ordinances.
So you're saying the Supreme Court and the Attorney General's office has previously ruled that us prohibiting that kind of discrimination is not allowed?
That's correct, under Dillon's rule.
Or maybe you can look into that and just report back to us.
We are continuing to look at it because it is an area of the law that is continuing to develop over time.
All right, thank you. Our next and last speaker.
Mr. Mayor, just very quickly, I'm wondering if federal law doesn't I almost use a verb, I'll trump that. I won't use that verb. Federal law might supersede that law, and it's a policy that I want us to adopt and enforce if at all possible.
Right. And we will look at that. I believe that the federal law may prohibit some discrimination, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the city is enabled to have such a provision. But we are looking into that, and I will be doing some more work on it in the next couple weeks.
Yeah, I think that'd be of interest to all of us up here. So, okay, let's move on. Our last speaker at this time, at least, is Mr. Sharp. Welcome.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. My name's Kieran Sharp, 408 Southwest Street. I've come tonight to speak against the addition of 3 cents to the tax rate for boosting the reserves that would be aimed at upcoming CIP projects. I do so not to try to hold down taxes on my home or other reasons of tax avoidance, but I think this is just the wrong approach to having a really successful CIP in terms of schools and other CIP projects. I think it's the wrong time and the wrong approach to it. And it's mainly because the standard for evaluating municipal bonds has changed since the financial crisis. And that standard now calls for assessing whether the municipality has an adequate capacity to meet the financial commitments under the security for the projected life of the investment. And that standard, Falls Church has had a very strong position in regard to that standard and would continue to do so under its current conditions of very strong personal and household income and home values going forward. It has some of those highest income and property values in the state, among any localities in the state. So the added reserves may please some bond rating agencies, but the added reserves may actually not save the city from a downgrade of the city's bonds, and it may instead push up the interest rate on those bonds and add cost to the debt service because of this change in the standard for evaluating municipal bonds. The usual bond rating agencies have themselves been downgraded for their poor performance in the financial crisis, so that bank regulators are now requiring banks to use a new standard that goes beyond the ratings of such agencies as Moody's, Fitch, Standard & Poor's when assessing the soundness of the securities that banks buy. The new standard calls for assessing whether the municipality has an adequate capacity to meet the financial commitments under the security, the bond in this case, for the projected life of the investment. And therefore, the city's capacity to repay a bond would be measured on a year-by-year basis, meaning that the most critical factor would be the ongoing ability of the city to produce adequate revenue to meet payments as they become due. So keeping annual payments at a reasonable level and keeping taxes low to spur business activity and property values are also parts of this new standards equation. The new standard is required by Section 939A of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, and I provided a reference there of a summary that the Conference of State Bank Supervisors has compiled of all the bank regulators' standards on this issue. And the reserves of the municipality in regard to this kind of municipal bond are not a factor in this case. And that's the Federal Reserve has a matrix on what factors are appropriate to look at in regard to municipal bonds. The reserves are only a factor in regard to municipal revenue bonds and not to municipal general obligation bonds. The factors listed for general obligation bonds include stability of tax revenues, diversity of revenue sources, local income, and home values. Thank you very much for listening. I did provide a written statement on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak at this time? You can still speak at the time the actual matter is heard, but if anyone wants to speak right now, you're welcome to. Okay, seeing none, why don't we go to council requests? Are there any council requests? Ms. Hardy?
I guess while we're on the topic of the subject of what Mr. Sharp just talked to us about, I was curious from the city manager how, I I guess assuming the Dodd-Frank Act doesn't get repealed, as it seems like likely with the current federal administration, how does what Mr. Sharp shared with us jive with what we've heard from our financial analyst Davenport, who I think has kind of strongly urged us to consider bolstering our reserves in light of the capital plan we have?
Our financial advisor has really taken kind of a basic municipal finance approach, and there are a series of metrics that it's not really even so much the rating agencies, but any jurisdiction in considering its own financial health has to keep in mind. And those include how much debt do you have for every man, woman, and child in the city? What is the proportion of your budget you have flexibility on? Debt service you have no flexibility on. And so debt as a percentage of your budget. Debt as a portion of your tax base, that's another key metric. And then lastly, the key thing that is the indicator of health, particularly going into a major capital program, is are you running a current account deficit, or are you running a current account surplus? A current account surplus is the most powerful indication that your city's financial house is in order and that you are a reasonable risk for debt. Those are all things that I think we can all readily understand and relate pretty closely to common sense in terms of how you accomplish big, ambitious capital goals. And that's the advice we've been getting. That is really the advice behind the capital reserve strategy. The city has been doing a lot of really strong financial management. Sale of the water system, the city invested a chunk of its proceeds into the pension fund to earn a perpetual return on equity for that investment and lower liabilities. That was a very long-sighted move. The city has also set aside funds to our capital reserves today. That's a very solid and strong move. Those are all great steps. Having built into the tax rate for the short period of time as you run up to your capital program is an indication of political will to accomplish this capital program and meet your future obligations. And I think that's really what the capital reserve strategy represents.
Mr. Snyder, did you have a request?
Yes, I did. Thank you. Yesterday, the League of Women Voters had a great session on transportation, and our own Cindy Mester was one of the panelists, and I'm wondering if there's a way we could link over to that or otherwise post the PowerPoint presentations. The other speakers were Amanda Baxter, who heads up the I-66 program, Monica Backman, who is the Executive Director for the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, and Kate Mattice, who is Executive Director of NVTC. These are all organizations that we participate in and fund, and frankly, the information that they had in their PowerPoint slides and the presentations would be extremely valuable to the public, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Vice Mayor Connolly.
Mr. Shields, I just want to express my appreciation for the city employees this weekend who went above and beyond in programs for our city. Yesterday was a particularly busy day, and it was really notable that there we were in the park for Arbor Day, and Kate Wright was working, and you were planting trees. And then we came over to Solarize, and Kate Walker was working on a Sunday, and Amy Maltese was running a program in the park. And the police were out at Clarendon's for several special events at Clarendon's. And then Cindy Mester was on the transportation panel. And I was so impressed that it was a Sunday and there were so many city employees out there working hard and willing to do that. So I'd just like to express my thanks to all of them.
Well, thank you, and appreciate that expression. It was a very busy day, and all these spring weekends are very busy, and it's a great time in the city. Thank you.
Mr. Duncan?
I just wanted to thank my colleague, Ms. Hardy, for asking the question about Mr. Sharp's letter, and I don't want to go into it further right now, but I assume we'll talk about that and the manager's thoughts on it a little bit later in the agenda.
Okay. Any other council requests? If not, let's move to the report of the city manager. Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Mayor Tarter, members of council. I've got two personnel announcements to make. First is sad news. Mary McMahon has announced to the library staff and to the library board last week that she's planning to retire after 18 years of service and leadership in our community as the director of the Mary Riley Stiles Public Library. She's been a great leader for the library with a great command of all the operations of the library, all the services that are provided there. A great feel for the traditions of the public library, but also a great sense about the potential for innovation and using technology in new ways. The library has really come a long ways in her tenure as our director. We will celebrate her achievements in the city. She's announced that her last day will be August 1st, and so there will be more on that as we get closer to that date. In the city charter, the provisions for recruiting a library director call out for a process that is very deeply collaborative with the library board, where the library board actually runs the recruitment and conducts the interviews and makes a recommendation to the city manager. We will be working together just to make sure that we've got all the recruitment information together, get the council's input into that recruitment and the community's input, and then proceed. So we'll be doing that, but we'll also be celebrating Mary's achievements over the coming months. I also want to welcome Kieran Bawa to the City of Falls Church as their new finance director. She's been instructed that she needs to say Happy Monday with all of her meetings. That was Richard LeCondre's calling card. Kieran comes to us from the West Coast. She served for a big chunk of her career with the City of Oakland as a budget director and deputy city administrator for the City of Oakland. And she also worked as the finance director for the City of Piedmont, California. And then she's moved to the East Coast for family reasons. And so we're very lucky to have her come and join us on our leadership team here with the city. Kieran, if you could stand up. And we had introductions at the work session, but this being our more formal regular session, I just wanted to introduce her to the community as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here. We're sorry your first meeting is our budget meeting, but I think you'll survive, or hope you'll survive. But we are really happy that you're here, and we look forward to working with you.
Likewise, council members, it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to collaborate with my colleagues who work under the leadership of Mr. Shields and each of you to continue to provide effective services to the residents of Falls Church. Pleasure is mine.
Thank you so much.
Also want to thank Melissa Ryman and the whole finance team for developing the budget this year and doing so in a very collaborative way with all of our department heads, with the community, and ultimately with the city council. And when we get into the budget cycle, we'll have more to say about that. But thank you, Melissa.
Thank you very much. Great job.
Just a few other things to announce. Tomorrow night, we will have an event that is being done in conjunction with We Support the Girls and other local groups, and to help adults protect children from sexual abuse. And this will be a training workshop. It's Tuesday, April 25th at 6:30 p.m. In the Dogwood Room here at City Hall. And so we'll go through a process of learning to learn the facts about sexual abuse, minimize the opportunities for where it can happen, open up communication about it, recognizing the signs of when it's happening, and how to react responsibly if you become aware or concerned that it may be happening. So this is all part of the council's declaring April as Sexual Assault Prevention Month and Child Abuse Awareness and Prevention Month, and as part of our ongoing efforts in that area. Lastly, I'd like to just note that all of the traveling public on Route 7 will experience some delays as we're paving on Route 7. This paving work is being paid for by VDOT through the Primary Extensions Program. And this is about a 3-year-old program that has been very helpful to the city to get additional funds to repair our roadbed surfaces. The state funding is for the eastbound lanes of Broad Street, all the way from West Street to Roosevelt. So it'll go all the way through the city. It is, however, just for the eastbound lanes. And next year, the funding will be for the westbound lanes. It, frankly, is something we asked them to make it so we could do all 4 lanes at one half of the city and all 4 lanes next year on the other half of the city. However, this is the way the funding was designated for the city, and so that's the way it's going to be done. So at the end of the day, we'll have very clean lanes on eastbound, and then next year we'll come back and finish the job on all the westbound lanes. So I ask for everybody's patience for that. And as Council Member Snyder mentioned, we had an excellent transportation panel over this weekend, and we will share all the information and the links from that. But a very informative session with the League of Women.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Oliver.
I'm sorry, when is the paving expected to begin?
It's starting this week in terms of utility work and getting some of the, where the manholes are and things like that, getting them prepped for the paving. But the first week of May and really through a big chunk of the month of May is where the milling and repaving will be happening. We'll be getting word out and trying to manage the traffic. It obviously will have a major impact for the city.
Okay. Also, we've discussed, I think, the idea of having a walking tour of the cottage home site. And I wonder if you could just get that word out, particularly to the neighbors, that that'll be occurring. It's coming up fairly quickly, and I don't think they really know about that.
We do. So on May 1st at your work session, we plan to do a walking tour of Railroad Avenue so the council can see and the community is welcome for this walking tour as well. So we're planning to start that at 7 p.m. on Railroad Avenue. So we won't meet here first. We'll just meet directly on Railroad Avenue to see the proposed site for the cottage development. And then at approximately 7:45, we'll reconvene then in the Dogwood Room for a work session as normal. The cottage's application will be on the agenda, and then we'll go through the rest of the work session agenda from there.
And the city will provide transportation, anyone who needs assistance, anyone who's handicapped or has accessibility issues?
Absolutely. If anyone wishes to attend and needs special accommodation, then we will be happy to provide that.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Oliver?
Can I just say that in light of the neighborhood concerns about parking on that street, if we could arrange carpooling just as a general practice, that would be helpful too.
Okay. Anything else, Mr. Shields?
That's all for tonight.
Okay, so my thought was we've got, I guess, 4 related items on the agenda this evening. My thought was to hear the staff reports for all of them together and basically have a discussion, a general discussion as wherever it may lead, and then vote on the 4 separate matters, kind of one after the other. Let me ask the city attorney, does that comport with your understanding of how we can handle this here?
Yes, that's, the charter allows you to do the entire budget plan in one public hearing and then take your votes.
And is that agreeable to folks up here? All right, sounds like it is. Then why don't we go ahead? I know we've got a disclaimer we're going to read, but why don't we let the city clerk call the items, all 4 items, and then the vice mayor and I are going to read a little disclaimer.
Okay. We have TO 17-05, an ordinance fixing and determining the budget of expenditures and revenues appropriating funds for the fiscal year 2018 General Fund, School Operating Fund, School Community Service Fund, and School Service Food Service Fund, Cable Access Fund, Sewer Fund, and Stormwater Fund. TO 17-06, ordinance fixing and determining the FY 2018 to FY 2022 Capital Improvements Program budget and appropriating expenditure and revenue funds for the fiscal year 2018. We have TO 17-07, ordinance setting the rate of tax levy on real estate for tax year 2018 and on personal property, machinery and tools, and all other property segregated by law for local taxation in the city of Falls Church, Virginia for tax year 2017. TO 17-08, ordinance to amend Chapter 40, taxation of the Code of the City of Falls Church to increase from 7 to 8% the tax on the total amount paid for room rentals in any lodging facility.
Thank you very much. Before we get started with your presentation, staff's presentation, would you like to go ahead and read your, I'm happy to go first. Or
I have consulted with the city attorney and make the following declaration before City Council's consideration of the proposed fiscal year 2018 city budget. I am an employee of the Falls Church City School Board and therefore am a member of a group of 3 or more persons that may be affected by the approval of the FY 2018 budget. I can participate in the transaction fairly, objectively, and in the public interest.
Okay, I have consulted with the city attorney as well and make the following declaration before City Council's consideration of the proposed fiscal year 2018 city budget. My wife is employed by the Falls Church City School Board, and therefore I'm a member of a group of 3 or more persons that may be affected by the approval of the FY 2018 budget. I can participate in the transaction fairly, objectively, and in the public interest. Mr. Shields?
Thank you.
Could I
F1
just
too?
ask a question of clarification? TO 1705 and 1706 refer to fiscal year 2018, and TO 1707 refers to tax year 2017. I just wanted to clarify that those are the same year.
That is correct, and those dates are correct.
Okay, Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Mayor Tarter and members of council. Tonight is the night scheduled for adoption of all the budget ordinances that were first brought before you on March 13th. And through this intervening 2-month period of time, this really is the period in which the staff recommendations really become the community's budget as it goes through all the public hearings and the town hall meetings that we've had and the work sessions where the council then shapes the budget to a level that you believe represents the community's values. For the public, the budget document's also available out on the table outside, and of course it's available online, and it lays out all of the spending for all of the departments and all the programs for the city, and lays out our performance measures and our desired outcomes from the spending that is proposed in this budget. At the work session a week ago, the council worked through some of the final markup for the budget. With respect to the operating budget, the consensus at the work session was to have an operating budget that required no change to the real estate tax rate. So the budget ordinance that is before you now for consideration tonight has a reduction of $400,000 in the overall budget, which is what is generated by the 1 penny on the tax rate for operations. Those reductions have been made in the ordinance that's before you. Item 2, with respect to the capital reserves, which was spoken to in some of the earlier public comment and the council's questions. In the managers, in my proposed budget, there's a 3-cent proposal for capital reserves, $1.2 million for capital reserves, that as I proposed it would be dedicated for the George Mason High School project. In the ordinance that's before you for the budget, there's a series of options for the council to consider on the capital reserves, from no contribution to capital reserves up to 4 cents for capital reserves, reflecting the discussion at the last work session. So let me go through just a few of the changes that were made through the process. So with the reduction that I mentioned just a moment ago with respect to the operating budgets, so for the total general government, there will be a 1.1% increase in spending, which includes an increase for WMATA in the amount of $275,000 relative to last year, and some increased spending for pay-as-you-go capital and to take care of facilities, an increase in debt service, and then for all other general government operations, essentially a flat budget or a $34,000 increase or a 0.1% increase. The school transfer as adopted by the school board, the request was 3.7% increase with a reduction of $137,000 to balance the budget. The school transfer would be a 3.3% increase relative to FY17. Here's how the numbers worked out from the work session last week. With the flat real estate tax, that was a $400,000 reduction from the operating budget. In working through our WMATA subsidy requirements, we originally had proposed a $400,000 increase from WMATA. We were able to trim that back based on what the WMATA board actually did when they adopted their budget on March 25th. So that's $125,000 reduction. With the remaining gap of $275,000, then that is split equally between the school division with $137,500 and general government $137,500. With respect to the school division, based on the information we received from the school administration, what our understanding is that with a 3.3% increase in the transfer, that does provide funding sufficient for the new teacher positions that were presented or proposed by the school board that were above the original council budget guidance. Now, I'll put the caveat in there that how the school board uses the transfer amount is up to the school board. However, that is the basic context in which that was understood in terms of how that reduction would likely happen. It would not affect the new teacher positions that were proposed. On the general government side, in terms of closing the $137,000 gap, what we discussed at the work session, what I would recommend is that we freeze a vacancy. We have the HR director position that is currently vacant, that we'd freeze that vacancy for FY18. We would have the assistant city manager, Cindy Mester, serve as our HR director. And Cindy, thank you for your leadership in this process. And Cindy's serving as our interim HR director today and is doing a great job with our HR team. But there are impacts to that, and we discussed those at the work session. We will reassess this. There will be certainly other vacancies that will open up as the fiscal year progresses, and we'll probably come back to the council with some additional thinking about that as the fiscal year goes through. But that will be the plan, certainly for the first 6 months of the fiscal year at a minimum. We discussed the CIP at length throughout the 2-month process that the council has had the budget before you. It's what we spend most of our time on these days is capital planning. But we discussed the projects in FY18 that will be debt funded, and they total $9.1 million. And then in FY19, with the big to be determined as a result of the school feasibility study that is underway, we'll have better cost estimates for those school programs. What we anticipate then is the capital improvements program will come back to the council in the June and July timeframe for consideration of an amendment to the CIP to reflect those updated costs. But even without the school project, we do have significant capital needs that we're trying to meet in the CIP, significant improvements for the community, and those are reflected here. In terms of George Mason High School campus planning, the council asked for an update to where we are in terms of our spending on our campus planning. The two efforts that are underway right now and will come to a much more public discussion in the month of May, June, and July. The first is the school feasibility study. At the end of tonight's agenda, we're asking for the council just to give a consent for the use of campus planning funds to be used for that feasibility study. It has a cost of $56,000. The purpose of that study is to validate the school program, estimate the costs, and develop a conceptual plan, or at least two conceptual plans based on some different configurations on how the school can fit on the site. Again, that work will be in the May and June timeframe. A market study is a few steps behind the school feasibility study to allow the information from the school study to inform the market study. But we anticipate that a market valuation will be prepared and ready for public review and discussion in the month of June and be finalized in July. And in our request for services for commercial real estate advisory services, we've also asked for strategic advice on the most effective way to bring the land to market when that time comes to maximize value and minimize risk to the city. That study, we don't yet have a cost for that phase 1 of that study, but we will have that cost fairly soon. Some estimates of what the costs of campus planning over the FY 2008, a total of about $560,000 of estimated projected costs to advance the campus planning effort. So the feasibility study, the market study, and then in addition, ultimately the development of the procurement documents for the school and the development of the process for the sale or lease of the land. Now, those estimates do include commercial real estate advisory service as well as legal advice, which will be necessary for a project of this scale and complexity. These are rough estimates, and more information will be forthcoming on those in the coming weeks, but that's our best estimate at this time in terms of impacts in FY18. The funding for these would come out of capital reserves, so I think that naturally does flow into the discussion about funding for the capital reserves as we get ready for this project. Overall, the big three capital projects in the CIP, of course, the high school and middle school project. On February 4th, we had a big town hall meeting where we laid out some of our thinking and our options for that project. 18 cents on the real estate tax rate is what we anticipate that project, the high school project, would cost if it's structured with 30-year debt and there is no commercial development that occurs on the site. So the big swing in terms of what the impact on the taxpayers is the extent to which that commercial development can be realized and works out as planned. So the lower end we've estimated to be about a 6-cent impact on the taxpayers for that project. City Hall Public Safety Project, that's a $13 million and an additional bonding that would be in FY19. That's the equivalent today of about 2.5 cents on the tax rate. And then the library project at the $8.7 million cost is 1.5 cents on the tax rate. So no other changes to the operating budget or other adjustments that we make. Those would be the equivalent pennies on the tax rate of the debt service for those the big three capital projects. So capital reserves, just some of the basic facts on it. It currently has a balance of $9.9 million. That's entirely from the sale of the water system, the proceeds from that sale. They have been, at this point, assigned for capital reserves. They have not been formally assigned to the high school project, but in all of our planning and our fiscal modeling for that project, the use of these reserves has been used exclusively now for the high school project. So what's my recommendation is to continue to grow that reserve balance at 3 cents on the tax rate. That would be $1.2 million. That does a couple of things. One, it builds into the tax rate the ability to absorb the future increase in debt service for the project. It will also, the way the reserves will function in our financing for the high school is, everyone has seen from the graphs from our debt service, there is a short-term peak, and then it levels off as some of our current debt service gets paid off. So the pre-funding will shave that peak and ultimately result in a lower tax rate than would otherwise be the case for the taxpayer. And then importantly, and I think this really gets to the strategy overall, and there are different ways that this can be done, we acknowledge that. But what the reserves will ultimately help us do is bridge the gap between when the debt is issued for the high school, we can soften the impact on the taxpayers until the benefits of the commercial development come online and are realized. The longer that bridge is, or the longer that gap is, the greater risk to the taxpayers of the city. The healthier our reserves are, the greater protection we have. But again, we do acknowledge there are multiple ways that this can be handled. We don't have all the answers yet, but we do anticipate that having healthy, and rather, this is an extraordinary project, and so extraordinary financial measures are, all the professional advice we've been getting indicate that it's wise and prudent for us to take steps to make sure that we're in a strong financial position as possible going into that project. The options that the council discussed, and these are laid out in the staff report, they're listed option 1 through 6, just so that they're all there. And the math is fairly simple. For every penny on the tax rate, that generates $400,000. So a half a penny generates $200,000. The options range from adding no pennies on the tax rate for capital reserves up to 4 cents on the tax rate for capital reserves, and the 4 cents is basically the notion of taking the savings from the operating side and having those savings go to capital reserves as well. That ends the staff report. I'd be happy to answer any questions on any of this material, any other questions the council has prior to your consideration and ultimate action on the budget ordinances before you.
Okay, so why don't we break this up into a question phase and then a comment phase at the end. Then I'm going to open it up to public comment, and I can do that now. Is there any member of the public that wishes to comment on any of the 4 matters before you tonight? Looks like we've got one speaker. When you're done, maybe you could fill out the speaker slip. I know we know who you are, but for the record, it'd be great to have that as well.
Hi, Robert Lajeunesse, 409 South Virginia Avenue. Like Mr. Sharp, I'm a tax and spend liberal. Actually, I'm a borrow and spend liberal. But the problem with this plan or pre-funding our borrowing needs 10 years from now is that it breaks that social contract. The spending doesn't take place. So when you put the money in the CIP, and instead of spending it on things like improved lighting on my street, South Virginia Avenue, I've mentioned it in the past, I either have to live in the dark and then the economy doesn't grow because I'm not spending money, or I can go out and finance my own lamppost. I have to finance it now because I'm paying an additional 3 cents taxes. And I can do that, but that's going to cost me more than it would cost the city because I face higher borrowing constraints than the municipality, because as an individual, my income can be disrupted at any time. Actually, Friday night at midnight, it might be disrupted as a federal employee. The city, on the other hand, has an unencumbered income stream and the ability to tax. That's a very powerful entity or ability that the city has, and I've spoken to many of you individually and through written comments. I will just encourage you that you don't use that preemptively until you actually need to do that taxing. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else in the public who would like to speak on any of the 4 matters before us tonight? Seeing none, the matter is closed to the public. Why don't we go to council comments? Not comments, questions. Council questions. Are there any council questions? People have questions of staff. Mr. Z and then Vice Mayor Conley.
Thank you, Mayor. Can you go back to the last slide where you've presented the options, and if you could just run through, even though the math is fairly simple there, what that represents in terms of what we get for the options. Perhaps work your way backwards from the 4 cents, what that does for us. Does it all go in the capital reserves? Does some of it, would some of that be earmarked for some planned spending? If you just run through that, that would be great.
So for, I'll start, Councilmember Z, at option 6. So at 4 cents on the tax rate, that would have a resulting tax rate of $1.35.5 per $100 of assessed value. It would generate $1.6 million for capital reserves. Now, in all of these scenarios, what I have put forward is a proposal to put them aside for the high school project. So in each of these scenarios, as proposed, there was not contemplated that it would be spent unless it was appropriated. For instance, in the slide just before where we talk about the expenses incurred just in the upfront planning for the high school project, that is all being spent out of capital reserves. So if that estimate of about $550,000 in FY18, or that's what it's going to take to get us all the way up to the point where the real architecture and engineering, it can be bond funded, would be paid for, and the real expenses start up, $550,000 arguably could be deducted from all of these contributions to capital reserves. But that would be that's going to be an action at a later time.
And can you tell me how much that would represent with regard to an actual increase on the taxes for an average median house?
Each penny on the tax rate for the average homeowner in the city, if we take the The average house in the city currently is $660,000. So every penny costs the average homeowner in the city $66. To make the math a little bit simpler, if we just round it to $70 for the average homeowner in the city, then 4 cents would be $280 for the average homeowner in the city. The 3 cent option is $210 for the average homeowner. The 2 cent option is $140, and the 1 cent option is $70.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor Connolly, did you have a question?
Mr. Shields, I just want to talk about the contribution to WMATA that we're making this year. We're putting $840,000 into WMATA, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that's $275,000 more than we put in last year.
Correct.
And that increase has been absorbed completely in the operating budget, right?
That is correct.
Okay. Which means other things you haven't been able to do in the operating budget.
That is correct.
That's correct. And then I guess what I really would like to establish is just how lean our operating budget is. We have stayed very close to the organic growth that was requested of 2.7%. We're right there. And we've absorbed $275,000 of WMATA. Right. Thank you.
Other questions? Question time. Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Leaving aside the merits of pre-funding for right now, let me just see if I can understand the mechanics a little better. So if we vote tonight to pre-fund at some level, that money would be collected, and what would happen if in July we decide that we are not ready to move forward yet with a high school referendum on any option? That's one possibility. Or let's say that we do choose some option and we go ahead with a vote in November, but that option does not succeed. Either path leads us to the same place, which is we reach the end of the calendar year without a specific high school plan. Is it the anticipation that we would still collect the amount of money that the council would choose to collect and put it where?
What I would recommend is that it be kept in the capital reserves, and you know, the ideal situation is before a project of this scale, we'd have 5 years of capital contributions built up. The ULI, if you'll recall, when they did their first analysis of this site, they identified we had about a $22 million funding gap that the city needed to fund with reserves. Now, we're not going to get to 22 million, but there is that this financing this high school is going to be very hard to do, and so having capital reserves is really the key, I believe, to making it remotely affordable for the taxpayers.
So the expenses that you referred to, $500,000 or so, that would come before we got to A&E, the contemplation is that those are going to be drawn from capital reserves, not financed over the life of the facility's total bond. Is that right?
When the project is fully approved and ready to go, then the first step would be to appropriate funds for the architecture and engineering. That would be the first big invoices that will come for the project. At that point, you're committed. It's going to happen, and that is an allowable use for debt financing. The preliminary planning is not really appropriate for debt, and that's why we're using capital reserves for these initial feasibility studies and those types of things to answer the threshold questions before the real green light for the project is made.
Okay, so up to now, we've spent a certain amount on trying to get to that, threshold. We would continue to incur those expenses until the bond referendum was approved, and we would then be able to transfer over those expenses into the long-term bond. Is that?
I would submit that that would occur after the referendum. It would not be a great practice to reach back and have a, say a refunding resolution to pay for these planning costs as part of a debt issuance. I think a better approach would be to, when you launch the next step, which is architecture and engineering as part of the bigger procurement, that be debt financed rather than reaching backwards.
Okay, so let's go, Ms.
I'm sorry, one other question. Is there any way to construe the collection of this money as in any way, let's say we, for some reason, don't pursue the high school project, you know, in the next fiscal year, in the new fiscal year, is there any way to construe that money that would be collected from the taxpayers and set aside in a lockbox for the high school would help us pursue the other CIP projects that, you know, are already in line and ready to go? Well, in line, if not nearer ready to go than the high school, such as the library and City Hall, and Mount Daniel for that matter. I mean, you see what I'm saying?
I do. If the council were to adopt the reserves tonight, they would be dedicated for capital reserves. And in all of our planning, we would have them dedicated for the high school project. If in the future the council wished to designate them for a specific project other than the high school, then the council could do so by ordinance. So we talk about councils can't bind future councils, but councils can lay out your policy, and you do so by ordinance, and you will do so tonight when you adopt this budget ordinance in whatever form it takes. And that is the city's policy. But if circumstances change and it becomes the wisdom of the council to change the designation of those funds in the future, you are able to do so by ordinance. But that would have with it all of the, you know, whatever the expectations that were set, I would think, for the community would carry into the future as well. And I'm sure that would have a great deal of weight with future councils as well.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I have now. Thanks, Mayor.
Ms. Oliver and then Ms. Hardy.
So, Mr. Shields, we heard earlier this evening from a citizen who felt that putting money into capital reserves would not help our ability to finance fund. And I'm wondering if perhaps we're confusing a couple of different things we have talked about in the past, which is having a surplus in unassigned fund balance versus having funds in capital reserves. I know when we looked at our fiscal policies and we looked at what we might need to do in order to stretch beyond our current borrowing capacity, our financial advisor had recommended at that time that we increase unassigned fund balance to help with getting the debt. He did not recommend increasing capital reserves. Is that correct?
He said that the most powerful thing you could do is increase unassigned fund balance.
So our desire to increase capital reserves is not specifically to get out the question of what it's going to cost us to borrow, but rather how we might use capital reserves to help our borrowing. And capital reserves by their nature can be used in lieu of debt, correct? You can pay for capital with your reserves as well as take on debt.
Correct.
And for the magnitude of the high school project that we have been talking about, whether it falls anywhere within that range, we know that regardless of the magnitude of that project, we have several years in which the debt service will be a peak before the other debt comes off the books. So regardless of any project that's chosen on the schools, we know we have this short-term peak. And our financial advisors working with you have advised that we could use capital reserves to shield our community from that peak, correct?
That is correct.
So that peak will come whatever we spend in the next 5 years. The magnitude of the peak is unknown, but there will be a peak. And what we're trying to do is build up capital reserves, not only to cover costs that could otherwise be bonded, but also to be able to shave that peak and protect the citizens of our community from a very heavy debt service before economic development or other mechanisms can come into play to take the burden off the taxpayer.
That is correct.
So spending a little bit of money now is protecting the taxpayers from a heavier burden in the interim period.
Sardi?
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, Shields, I had a question and clarification on the amount we've spent to date on the high school campus project. So my understanding is that we've spent nearly $700,000 out of reserves for the work. I think this is from this ledger you all provided us. And I think on the slides, we expect we'll spend another $500 before we can get to a referendum. Is that correct?
I think that will carry us past the referendum. There's some pieces of this that are post-referendum, and taking the land to market as a big chunk that is post-referendum. And so that piece of it is for legal and commercial real estate advisory services, so the share before the referendum is probably not much more than the feasibility study and the market study. That's really what will get done pre-referendum, and then post-referendum, we still have some of these softer costs that we don't think would be appropriate to bond finance, but they're still in that sort of getting things teed up and getting them ready for when the rest of the project can be bond financed.
I just want to make sure that I should be adding the numbers and not subtracting one from the other. So it's 1.2 in total, some of it before the referendum, some of it after, but 1.2 or thereabouts.
In total, before we're issuing bonds, it might be the better time threshold.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? All right, if not, we want to move to comments. Do people have comments? Want to like to make any Vice Mayor Connolly? No? Does anyone want to make comments before we take a motion? No one at all? Why don't we move down the table? Do we want to do that?
I'll just start by saying that the Budget and Finance Committee met on Friday, and they support the manager's recommendation.
All right, thank you. Anyone like to make any comments before we take a vote? Well, we can make a motion. Sure, we can make a motion. If someone would like to make a motion, I think that's fine. Okay. So would someone like to make a motion? Or would you want to make a comment, or do you want to make a motion? Okay, go for it.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank the city manager and staff. I think, as the vice mayor had indicated, our budget is largely flat as proposed, and I think given the large increases we have from WMATA, the school growth of over 6.5%, which was double what we expected, I've been really impressed with how much we've done on the operating side, and I think it reflects a lot of our values and our commitment to the future. I was thinking about last year's vote and why I voted to support a flat tax rate last year. And it was based on a couple different operating principles. One is just the balance between short and long-term needs. And I think there's recognition by both City Council and the school board that we need to do both. And I think that requires sacrifices in the short term and operating on a lean operating budget. So I've been really impressed with the efforts that everyone's taken on both the schools and general government side to not just take the easy path, but really try to make the smart, tough choices on where we can be more efficient and lean. I'm not thrilled with a lot of the compromises we had to make on both sides. But I think they are prudent and are necessary to pay for those big ticket items. And so on that end, I think it's not a surprise to anyone that I do support funding capital reserves, because I do think it's an important step to show our commitment for these long-term big ticket items. I think it's prudent for us to think about a modest, moderated tax increases. I think it's irresponsible for us to spring a tax rate increase on people, because we know these things are coming. We know the high school project is going to cost us something. We know City Hall is going to cost us something. We know the library is going to cost us something. And I don't think any of the work that's ongoing between now and June is going to result in a free project anywhere. So I think it's important for us to take the necessary step now and do the responsible thing and fund the capital reserves at some level while keeping tight reins on the operating budgets.
Sure.
I'm going to move to adopt TO 17-05, option 4.
Okay, and for edification, what is the,
Oh, that's increasing the tax rate by 1.5 cents to $1.33 per $100 of assessed value for a $600,000 contribution to capital reserves. Revenues and expenditures are set forth in the chart that Mr. Shields showed earlier.
Okay, do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, before we take a vote, are there comments on the motion before us? Mr. Snyder?
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor. I want to thank all of our citizens, city staff, and everyone who's commented on our budget. You've made the process a lot better. Thank you. Tonight's vote is a phase in a continuum that started with last year's budget guidance from the council, basically keep growth in budgets to that which would be expected at existing tax rates. The manager held true to that goal, and so did the schools, with a potential addition of 1 cent for various purposes. However, the city manager also included a proposal to pre-fund the school CIP with a 3-cent tax increase on top of the 1 cent, making a total proposed 4-cent tax rate increase. On the day that was unveiled, several of us objected and indicated we could not support that proposal. That was followed by Phil Duncan and me voting to oppose even advertising at the 4-cent increase. I also provided at the first work session a dozen or so matters to look into possible reductions at the first budget work session. Today, I'm happy to say that the operating budgets of the city and schools can be funded responsibly at the existing tax rate. After I confirmed that the instructional needs of the schools will be funded at that rate, and that's critical to maintain class sizes, I agreed to that outcome. Keeping class sizes small is, in my opinion, a major goal of school funding, and I think we achieved that with this budget. On the capital refunding proposal, I was never a great fan. That is because I fear that it would be viewed as preemptory taxing or piling on. More importantly, citizens, by holding on to their money, can get a higher return than we can. In addition, our capital needs have not been finally determined. As importantly, taxing now for a project that has not yet gone to the voters via referendum could be construed as taking the decision away from the voters. And asking for money before we need it, I fear, will jeopardize our credibility when we need it. However, the discussion at last week's work session included a conversation about the issue that expenditures made to support the high school work and that will have to be made to give the citizens full information to inform their vote in the referendum have cut into a capital reserve of roughly $10 million that we set aside for capital projects as part of the forced sale of the water system. Maybe because I lived from beginning to end through those rather dark days, that I feel it absolutely fundamental to maintain that capital reserve. Accordingly, I'm willing to support a 1 cent increase, $400,000, to prevent further erosion of that reserve, and over 2 years return it to near its original amount available for capital projects in the CIP. This expenditure will also assure that voters have the information they need for a referendum on the high school. In addition, as we heard yesterday from Paul Baldino, the long-term chair of the CACT at the League of Women Voters Forum on Transportation, there's a higher demand for neighborhood traffic calming than there are funds to even begin to meet it. And no funding was provided in the city manager's budget for that. Accordingly, I'm also willing to support an additional 1/2 cent in reserves, hopefully to meet that community need in the future. And I understand that would take another action. Finally, I want to address the issue with Metro. Metro must never be the kind of burden on our taxes in the future that it is this year. Although I objected in regional meetings, the larger jurisdictions were willing to live with this rather dramatic increase. I think what we're finding more and more is even they can't live with it. So I'm committed in the future to working every way I can to represent the city so that Metro will never be this kind of financial burden on us again. In conclusion, a budget of this kind, I feel, is responsive to the need for fiscal prudence, and our citizens have very legitimate concerns over the tax rate. At the same time, I feel that this proposal, that is a proposal that has just been made and seconded, helps assure a very high quality of school and city services and addresses, in my view, a critical public safety need in our community, that is the need for additional funds for neighborhood traffic calming. So with that, with those balance of interests, I'm prepared to support this motion. I believe it is both financially prudent, fair to the taxpayers, and will help us address our community needs for first quality school and city services. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? Does anyone else have any comments? Mr. Z?
Thank you, Mayor. In our last city council meeting, we as a council showed leadership by increasing the amount necessary to move forward to building Mount Daniel Elementary School. This came after enormous amount of soul searching and discussion, and we made the right decision to increase the amount that we would require from our citizens to pay for this elementary school expansion. Now, we realize, and there's been lots of talk, that we have a bunch of multi-generational decisions to make, in addition to the grand old lady, as our interim school superintendent refers to George Mason. There's schools, yes, but also City Hall, library, a whole flock of other actions. You know, we wrestle with a practical consequence of taxation. If we raise the tax rate, and talk about the median cost of housing, single-family housing, but we know it's likely not going to be $630, but more in the $1.5 million range that we're talking about. So what we're really doing is making an amount northward of $500 not available to the taxpayers. So there's been lots of comments already about what the taxpayer could do with that money. But if we take it out, it just, if we increase the tax rate, it would lie fallow. We take it out of circulation. We make it inaccessible to our taxpayers. There's also been discussion that if we don't have a tax rate increase, it would have an impact on the city's bond rating. I'm not convinced by that. We are not the city of Compton. We're not Detroit. We have shown time and again that we have the resilience and capacity and capability to have tax increases as necessary. So it's not clear to me that there would be a negative impact to our city's bond rating. I think that's just scare stuff, and I'm not persuaded by those kinds of tactics. So the fulcrum decision is whether in fact we look at our taxation situation in a prospective manner, or do we actually align our taxes with the need after we understand what the contracts are and what the proposals are, and what the scope of those activities are. Having gone down that road before, where we based decisions that would have a tax consequence on prospective, I'm disinclined to go down that same road again. We do realize that taxes are the basis upon which we build a great city, a great civilization. And when there comes a time, I believe that we will have the will and can and must raise the taxes, but at the appropriate time. So the final analysis, I have to say it is, in my mind, principles-based, that I firmly believe that we can maintain our high level of operations and services without increasing the tax rate for FY 2018. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Ms. Oliver?
So I want to start by saying that contrary to what some people in the community seem to think based on my past statements, I don't actually find any great joy in raising the tax rate. And I am really not trying to make other people pay a lot of taxes, and I don't personally myself want to pay any more taxes. I think because I've spoken up in the past about trying to be fiscally responsible and looking at the long-term picture, and that I feel that requires us to put some money aside now, people think, oh, Karen just wants to raise our taxes. But I don't. You know, I'm not crazy, and I'm not rich. What some people have dismissed as, oh, $200, that's a night out on the town, was for much of the last year my food budget for the month. Okay, I was unemployed, and $200 means an awful lot to me right now. So don't think that I am voting for a tax increase lightly. You know, that said, I do feel strongly that the financial sustainability of this city requires us to think about the long term, and that this contribution to capital reserves is really important for us to be able to do the heavy school and other infrastructure lift that we have to do in the years ahead. I personally disagreed with the work session majority decision to cut the operating budget of the schools and the city, to cut that penny out. But having cut that penny out, I propose that if we were going to do that, let's go ahead and put the money into capital reserves. I'm the reason there's an option 6, which says let's put 4 cents into the capital reserves. I think that we will get by with the operating budget flat that we made. But I think that we have restricted the schools and we have constrained the city in areas of personnel that are very critical. And we're going to have to manage carefully, and luckily we have good managers on both sides that will be looking at that. So that said, while I want 3 or 4 cents to go for the capital reserves, because I think it's absolutely critical for getting the schools, plural, and the other facilities that we need in the future, I don't think it's likely that a majority of council would be willing to go as high as I'm willing to go. And if a majority of council can support option 4, I will support option 4, because that's as much as we can get. Thank you.
Thank you. Other vice? Okay, whatever you guys want.
I'd just like to thank everyone who's put a lot of time and effort into this budget. It's been an interesting budget season. They all are interesting seasons, and in all of them, we're trying to fit the pieces together and plan for the short term and the long term. I think the budget as proposed here shows our community priorities. We have an operating budget that's within organic growth. We're absorbing $275,000 in WMATA costs, but our organic growth is higher than anybody else around us. And that means that economic development is working in Falls Church, and that's something we really need to be proud of. And I think that lights the way for our future. So congratulations to everyone who's worked on that economic development. It's going to accommodate our schools, it's going to accommodate our neighborhoods, our priorities in transportation and other matters. So I'm really optimistic as we plan for the future, and we want to do big things in our CIP. Like Ms. Oliver said, it would be great to be able, I think, to put more than 1.5 cents into the CIP, because we really are planning for a very big future. We've never contemplated bonding as much money as we're contemplating bonding right now. And while the high school has not yet been approved by the voters, it has been considered in this community for a long time. And no matter what we do, we're going to have to borrow a lot of money for that high school. So I think that 1.5 cents is going to get us there, get us started on that capital, and really get us moving, because I think it's important that we stop talking about it and we actually start doing something.
Thank you. Mr. Duncan?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to share my misgivings about the pre-funding strategy. I've listened carefully tonight and to the input we've received from citizens, and thought a good bit about this on my drives back and forth to Tennessee of late, and asked myself, why am I reluctant to support this bold measure? And I think it is a bold measure, because normally I lean bold. I think back to the first budget I supported, which gave a double-digit increase to the schools, because it was clear during the Great Recession post years that everybody had suffered some considerable cutbacks, and I just thought that it was very appropriate to support the budget that I did, and the case had been well made. The allocation of a substantial amount of money in our reserves to the pension fund was another sort of long-term discussion that we had over many months, probably I think more than a year, and in the end I supported that. That, looking back, is money that we could be using for other purposes today, but I think it was the right thing to do. And finally, the creation of a stormwater fee, another big thing that we did, because we were told we would not meet our obligations if we did not have a separate fee and plan for carrying out those obligations. All three of those I supported, I think, because in the end I was able to, explain to people why there was a compelling reason to do so, and I just have not been able to get to that point on this pre-funding of the CIP. I think it's for one main reason. I feel like the one leverage that we have is the tax rate to get things that we want. As Ms. Hardy and others have said, restraint in operating spending year in, year out is just critical for, at least for me, for the next 3 to 5 years in order to prosecute the campaign on the CIP that we need. I'm happy that the current budget shows restraint in operating. I do wish that this budget had, been a chance for us to say, you know what, we're going to do that for 3 years. We're just going to agree with the schools, that on the schools and city side both, we're going to create that level of expectation, because it's basically telling employees how much money they're going to earn. That's what I've learned a lot of this boils down to. And if you tell them at the very beginning of the budget year, you know what, we're just not going to be able to give raises more than about what inflation is, then the actual expectation that's set, and people, they're not thrilled about it, but they're not disappointed when later on they were promised 3 and they've got to cut back to 2. I would have liked to have seen us take advantage of this occasion to, say something longer term about our commitment to restraining operating spending in order to pursue the CIP projects. In previous meetings, I've mentioned several other things that I would like to see us do. I would like to be able to go tell voters tomorrow, after the council has voted the way it appears it's going to vote. We've also worked on other levers that we're going to pull. We're not just raising your taxes. We've got a plan, and we've got, targets on generating revenue through economic development. Not necessarily up at the Upper West Side, because that is going to take many years, but just in the regular order of business in locations around the city, we're really going to apply ourselves to, meeting a growth in revenue target every year for economic development. Consolidations and efficiencies in administrative functions on the cities and school sides. I think there are opportunities there that we just have to examine. We talked about this at a previous meeting. Examining the assessments so that everybody is confident. You still hear talk all around town. I improved my house 3 years ago, and my assessment is still the same as it was 3 years, before I did the improvement. I'd like to be able to answer people that, our assessor is rated as 95% great, and that is great. But, we actually could use him to be 98% great, because the 3% improvement there would be real money that we could spend at this time. Understanding this reserves policy, Mr. Sharp, Mr. LaJeunesse, their comments, I listened to what the manager said in response, and I just feel like there's a whole lot more opportunity for understanding and a deeper, communication with the public, so that there is not this feeling that, again, you hear a lot of, that our unassigned fund balance, our fund balance generally, our reserves policy, is just overly conservative. It's quick to tax and unnecessarily conservative, given our capacity for generating revenues through taxation. These other steps, I just wish that this budget could have been an opportunity for us to go tell the public that we're taking at least 4 or 5 steps in other areas in addition to raising the tax rate. I think that would create a better environment for, the CIP debate we're going to have. And that brings me to the last point, which is my real frustration is, I think I'm more, maybe than anybody up here, I want to do these projects. I want to do Mount Daniel. I want to do City Hall. I want to do the library. I want to do a high school that will last for 75 years. We obviously have different opinions about, how to, absorb the costs of whatever we do. But I would feel better if we were raising taxes with a clear statement that, we're going to do these things. Voters voted on the library. We're going to do the library. And we're going to finish Mount Daniel. We're not going to dither around City Hall anymore. We're going to do City Hall. We're going to make a proper building that's safe for our employees and citizens. And finally, we're going to take this high school thing on, and we're going to build a high school that will, last for some version of the ages. And I just don't feel like this council has sent that signal. And for that reason, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to vote against the motion.
Okay, other comments? If not, I've got a few comments. One, I'm glad we've reached a consensus on the operating budget, particularly a flat operating budget. At the end of the day, we need to live within our means, as our taxpayers do. And that's going to allow us the flexibility to do the important capital projects that we're going to need to do in the future. But I think it's premature to be raising taxes for a new high school. It prejudges the decision that is going to be rightly decided by the voters, presumably this fall. It takes money out of taxpayers' pockets before the money's needed, and I believe the taxpayers are the best place to be hanging on to money, not government. Our city gets very poor returns on our money. At times, I believe it's approached 0.1%, basically savings account numbers. And with the reserves we already have, I think that's approximately $23 million that we've got it sitting in fairly low return money. We don't get to use the money as a city like taxpayers do. We can't put it in stocks or other higher yielding investments. And so our money, frankly, in some ways, I think sits idle. We talked about saving for college, that this is somewhat similar for college, but in some ways we would never put our college savings in a sock under the bed because the returns are so low for city investments. So I have concerns about that, and our money loses its value year after year, as some of the $10 million we've put aside from the water sale proceeds have done. In contrast, I supported use of funding our underfunded pension because that money was put in high-yielding returns, which average 7% or so a year, which is great use of money. It's an efficient use of money. I also believe we've not fully explored our opportunities on the campus site, and so I'm not as pessimistic as some of my colleagues. I think there are more opportunities than many believe, and I believe there are also risk mitigation strategies that haven't been fully explored. We're in the process of engaging and hiring those experts now, and I think we'll have more information this summer, but I'm more optimistic than others. I think we also need to be cognizant of our tax rate. Let's not squeeze out the elderly and other people of modest means. We need to continue to have a balanced community that's affordable to those on fixed incomes. Finally, I'd echo the thoughts of my colleagues, particularly Mr. Duncan, about economic growth. I think our discussion tonight reinforces the need to continue to accelerate economic growth and development in our city. I think we made some great progress over the past years, and our planning efforts and other efforts I think will pay off as time goes on, but I think it does reinforce that point. But for those reasons, I will not be supporting the motion tonight. Is there anything else, any other comments anyone has, or should we go to the vote?
Sure, Mr. Mayor, just a couple comments. I want folks to, I'm sure there'll be a great many references to that chart in the future, knowing our community. It's very important to understand that those who supported pre-funding vigorously have made a major compromise in adopting option 4. It's about a third of the potential high amount, and I think they've made a serious effort to go midway. I just want to clarify my own view is that I view my vote as restoring the capital reserve established by the sale of the water system, preventing further erosion, and therefore restoring that, and at the same time providing the funds necessary to do the advance work that citizens need to have to make an informed decision in November. And I also support using some of the money, as I mentioned, for neighborhood traffic calming. So my vote is based upon those unique factors and is explainable in those terms. But I do think everybody's worked very, very hard. It's been an honest exchange, and everybody is trying to do the very best they can for the good of the public, and I hope that that's appreciated by all. Thank you.
Okay, Madam Clerk?
Sorry, could I just ask one, the neighborhood traffic calming thing, did I miss something? I thought there was carryover money from the current fiscal year in the new fiscal year budget for neighborhood traffic calming. Is that not right, or is that right?
That is correct.
Okay.
All right, Madam Clerk?
Ms. Conley?
Sorry, are we voting on the first?
This is a motion to adopt TO 17-05, option 4. Ms. Conley moved and Ms. Hardy seconded.
Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
No.
Ms. Hardy?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
No.
Mayor Tarter?
No.
The motion carries 4-3. Thank you, council.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to the next item. And that is,
It's TO 17-06, and that is the CIP.
okay, do we have any additional comments or any comments or questions about the CIP portion of this hearing?
Can you give me the elevator speech on the CIP? What are we doing?
Well, the CIP, basically, as what's before the council is the CIP that is the same CIP that was approved and recommended by the Planning Commission and recommended by the city manager. So there have been no substantive changes to the CIP as it's gone through the public process over the past 2 months. The key things, I could put the slide up in terms of the key things that would be funded in FY18 if we'd like to go through those.
No, you don't have to do that. I guess I'm thinking, if I may, the process forward now to come back to us at some point with revisions and extensions.
So what is anticipated is that with this, the results of the school feasibility study is that one of the first things we'll do then is amend the CIP to incorporate the cost estimates that come with the school projects. And at that time, there may be consideration of other aspects of the CIP as well, but that certainly would be the main policy question that would occur in the June/July timeframe.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any additional, Ms. Hardy?
Thank you, Mayor. So more of a, I guess, comment on the CIP in response to a number of the citizen letters we received about the library project and, requests for us to not shift money from the library to other projects. And so to clarify, my understanding is we don't have any bonds issued for the library yet. So there's no, while we have voter approval, there's no money being shifting anywhere. Certainly, we're not making any decisions on that right now. In June, it sounds like we probably need to have a very frank discussion once we know what those new costs will be for both the high school project, the new TJ project, to figure out what the right sequencing of projects are and if we choose to do any changes to the CIP. Is that correct?
That certainly would be available to the council to discuss in that June and July timeframe, yes.
I just want to make sure that it wasn't misconstrued in the community that we're moving any money around, because right now, there's actually no money taken out for the library.
Right.
Okay, any other questions or comments about the CIP? Let me ask the city attorney. I did ask for public comments earlier. Is that sufficient, or should I do that once again for this portion of the hearing?
It's sufficient to hold one hearing on the entire plan and then take your votes.
Okay. Is there any other questions or comments to be had here? If not, is there a motion? Would someone like to make a motion?
Mr. Mayor, I move to adopt TO 17-06.
Second.
Have a second? Madam Clerk, will you call the vote, please?
Yes, sir. Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Hardy?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
Yes.
Mayor Tarter?
Yes.
And the motion carries. Thank you.
All right, let's move on to the next portion of the hearing.
And that is TO 17-07. That's the ordinance setting the real estate and personal property tax rates.
Okay, are there any questions or comments about this portion of the hearing?
Mayor
I know it
Tarter,
generally
members of
follows.
council, so what we've put on the board, and it's up on the screen then, is the option for the tax rate is the $1.33 rate, and so that is shown in the highlighted text here.
Okay. Are there any questions or comments at this point?
We need to change line 82 to reflect tax year 2018.
I think the city attorney was about to say, so the motion would need to state that at line 88 to, can you state the motion better than I could?
Yes, it's the alternative motion that's at lines 25 and 26. At the end of line 25, change the number 87 to number 88. And then at the end of line 26, it should be with a rate of 133. So the alternative motion is move to adopt TO 1707 with amendment at line 88 to replace the real estate tax rate of $1.34.5 with a rate of $1.33.
Sorry, so do we need to amend them? Do we have a motion? We do have a motion. We haven't taken a motion yet. Okay, I'm sorry. Would anyone like to make a motion? Okay.
I move to adopt TO 17-07 with an amendment at line 88 to replace the real estate tax rate of $1.34.5 with a rate of $1.33.
I think it was $1.35.5 was the number.
Second.
That's what's on the screen.
Oh.
Is that on the screen? Am I?
Adopted at first reading was $1.35.5.
Oh, I'm sorry. What was? My apologies. They've already changed that. So that's already.
Yeah, that's
Okay, I take
Okay.
it. Just never mind whatever I just said. All right. So do we have a proper motion on the table?
Yes.
Okay. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Any comments or questions before we take a vote? All right. Let's go to a vote.
okay. Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
No.
Ms. Hardy?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
Yes.
Mayor Tarter?
Yes.
Motion carries 6-1. Thank you.
Okay. Let's go to the last portion of this part of the hearing.
And that's TO 17-08, and that is to amend the code to increase the lodging tax from 7% to 8%.
Okay. Do we have any questions or comments on this item? Okay. Do we have a motion? Yes.
City Manager, when do we expect to be able to start drawing from this if it passes tonight?
Well, the transient occupancy taxes are collected on a monthly basis, I believe. And so the what's on the expenditure side of the budget, which you've already adopted, there's $60,000 dedicated for downtown or for commercial district improvements. So that will be the plan for FY18. We'll assess revenues and then we'll adjust it from FY19 beyond. But that is the commitment and the dedication in FY18.
Any other questions or comments? If not, would someone like to make a motion?
Mayor, I move to adopt TO 17-08.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Madam Clerk?
Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Hardy?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
Yes.
Mayor Tarter?
Yes.
Motion carries 7-0. Thank you.
Great. Let's move on to the consent items. Is there anyone who would like to remove any item from the consent agenda?
Mayor, move the calendar of items on consent to be adopted.
Okay, do we have a second?
Second.
Madam Clerk?
Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Hardy?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
Yes.
Mayor Tarter?
Yes.
Motion carries 7-0.
Okay, why don't we move on to the campus project update? Mr. Shields?
There are several things to update the council on, and there's also a request. And the request would be for the council to follow on the action of the school board that occurred last Tuesday night, and that is to authorize the use of the campus planning CIP funds by the school board for a contract with architecture firm of Perkins Eastman to conduct the feasibility study, the George Mason High School feasibility study that we've discussed earlier tonight. The lump sum contract amount for that work is $56,580. And so that is a request for tonight. In addition to that, we've been working with the school administration on a schedule over the coming weeks and a couple of key dates for the public's interest. On June 10th, we were planning to have an update for the community on the small area plan. And we're also anticipating that in that time frame of June 10th, this is a Saturday, that the feasibility study will be through its process, and that it would be a good time to take the findings and recommendations from Perkins Eastman on the conceptual plan for the school, for the cost estimates for the school, for the resolution of the school programmatic issues that we've been discussing over the past several months, resolution of the parking issues, and how to handle the playing field. So those are some of the major issues that the feasibility is meant to help us have some greater clarity on. And so that June 10th meeting would be a target date to get that information out to the public. In addition, the city has issued an RFP for the market study, and that's being overseen by the Economic Working Group. And we have a pre-proposal conference for prospective bidders on Wednesday this week, on Wednesday morning. And we hope to have a good response to that solicitation. The proposals are due in early May, and we'll bring the top-ranked respondents to the Economic Working Group for an interview or presentation similar to the way that the Campus Working Group had a meeting with the Perkins Eastman Group before making its recommendation on that contract. So the Economic Working Group will work in a similar fashion. The months of June and July then would be the last meeting of the council in June would be a tentative date for a first reading on a CIP amendment, as well as a first reading on a bond referendum question. Then we'd have a month before July 24th for second reading for both of those items. So that's a kind of a rough schedule that we've been, with some of the main dates that we try to work around a whole series of additional meetings to try to hit those main dates. We recognize that it's a lot of work and some pretty big decisions in that July timeframe, and we're working hard to have the information ready to support the public decisions that the council ultimately will have to make along with the school board. That's a quick report. Dr. Schiller is here as well if you have any questions on this update.
Mr. Z.
Thank you, Mayor. I just taking a quick look at this, and I say quick because it was handed out shortly before we convened tonight. Maybe others have seen this before I have, but this is the first time I've seen this with regard to the scope of the feasibility study. So, and maybe this is a question for the school superintendent. City manager, when you characterize that the parking issue has been resolved, what exactly does that mean? Because here on the bottom page 3 it says, in any scenario, the site layout plans are to provide 400 service parking spaces for school use in each alternative. So I see no changes between what was initially presented and here we are now. So when you say the parking situation has been resolved, does that mean it's been resolved in favor of keeping things as they were, where we're giving up acres and acres of valuable space that could be developed or given to school facilities for parking cars? Let me tell you, if that's what's going on, this study is DOA when it comes here. Thank you.
What the scope of work does ask that in each of the scenarios that I believe that 400 parking spaces be provided. That's so that when you're doing the massing and the blocking and the space.
Sir, well, it says 400 surface parking. Plans are to provide 400 surface parking spaces. Am I misunderstanding the English commonly used in America?
Okay, well, the purpose of that, as I recall from the scoping of the work, was so that that issue can be clearly seen in terms of what the impacts of that requirement would be. And so we don't, in our planning up to this
You're
point,
saying we're going to spend $56,000 and throw away the results at the end because if they say, well, you told us to put this in, so we did. What am I not understanding here? Someone explain this to me. On page 3, provide 400 surface parking spaces.
well,
Does it say that or not? Let's answer that first question.
it does say that, but I think there's some context for why that is requested.
Well, please explain that so I understand it.
Okay.
And perhaps anyone else that reads this.
Well, let me give a stab at it, and then there can be some discussion of it. So the school program has called for parking. And that we know that's expensive, we know that it takes up a lot of space. And so by having the feasibility study lay out, is it possible to fit that? How would it fit if it were surface? Because that's the lowest cost option, at least from a construction perspective, maybe not from a land use perspective. Will it fit that way? Now, we'll get the answers. And then from there, we'll assess, A, can we afford to have 400 parking spaces, or do we need to change our policies? Or do we need to solve the parking in a different way? But by having that standardized, it makes it so you really confront that issue. And I think the outcome of the study is to have us confront it and make some decisions on how we're going to handle parking for the. That's my shot at it. Others can jump in terms of how that's going to be addressed.
Well, I guess what I would say is I think you're looking at the problem from the wrong lens. To me, the question really should be how much parking do you need for this different massing? Not necessarily you need 400, how does it fit in? Because I think that's sort of distorting the question. In my opinion, 20 years from now, I mean, maybe we'll have self-driving cars or we'll have some other means of transportation. We need none of this parking or very little of it. And so I guess I'm thinking we're sort of presupposing an answer by coming up with 400. I thought we sort of had this discussion earlier as well, that the idea of having surface parking driving the train is probably not a great idea. I think we need that kind of information, but there may be alternatives that have been discussed as well about putting it off-site. For example, using the UVA Virginia Tech parking lot, we may need no parking. So I guess what I would just say is I don't want to, rock the boat and knock everything over, but I do think that if this is going to be something that someone's going to use as the basis of a model, it seems to me like it ought to be kind of the other way around. In other words, the school facilities be the driving force, and whatever parking there is, let's talk about it, and there'd be alternatives that are lower cost. But supposing there's going to be 400 parking spaces and there'd be surface spots, I think is an issue. I mean, I don't know how many acres, someone probably could tell me how many surface spaces an acre of land is. I'm guessing we're talking multiple acres of land devoted just purely to surface parking. And I would hate for that to take away from economic development. In other words, not being able to develop 10 full acres because we have to have 4 acres of surface parking. So I don't know the answer to the question, but I do think that Mr. Z has raised a good point. And I don't know really how to deal with that or answer that, but I think from someone who's got a little bit of background in this, that is a concern to me as well. If others have thoughts. Mr. Snyder?
Well, I want to move forward on this, but I think you've already heard concerns about parking, and what I see absent here, maybe I missed it, was the potential role for Metro and the universities. One potential would be that parking would be, we'd use the Metro lot, or it would be in the university. So I think the comment is right on. That is, one scenario might be, okay, you put surface parking on the existing site, but we know that that's going to be a huge waste of real estate. So we ought to look at meeting the parking, whatever the requirement is, looking at potential Metro and the university. So one scenario might be it's on site, and I think we'll all be able to see from that exactly what at least 2 council members have said, which is that's a huge waste of space. There ought to be scenarios without that. And my question is this flexible enough to allow this concern to somehow be addressed? Dr. Schiller, do you want to make a comment on that?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, by no means does this presuppose that 400 parking spaces is going to be the solution that's going to be recommended through the feasibility study. What the feasibility study could not do, though, as we discussed among ourselves and is make an assumption that there's land elsewhere that the city does not have that it could be used for something. I know there are other conversations taking place there, but I think we all come to realize that the need for the parking, as we see it today, may not be realized when it comes to cost and the available land. And much like the examination of a pool and the playing fields, these are all the things that have been said that folks wanted to be considered to see whether they're feasible, what the cost is, and how their use would be. I know there are other initiatives that are taking place now that's exploring alternative use for adjoining property that is not part of the cities. And it would seem to me that we all know that this is what it is, a feasibility study to say what you can have, what you can afford, and what you're not going to be able to fit there. And as you have pointed out, what is the driver here is the facility to educate the students. After all that, the support areas, they would have to be secondary and tertiary. So I think the description that's put forward here about the parking is a minimal description, does not capture what we've talked about with the architects at all. They well understand that on a limited amount of acreage, that not all of these needs that have been identified for today and tomorrow are going to be realized. And so I do hope that as you go forward, that you'll be able to explore a grad center area, the WMATA area, and other areas that we've not talked about for alternative uses. And if you are looking 20, 30, 40 years down the road, the likelihood of not having parking there at all is quite high. There will be some policy decisions to be made. Jim Snyder from your planning department has been providing us with information from adjoining cities and counties with where they have grappled with limited parking and the impact on students and staff and what kinds of policy decisions will have to be made. And there are going to be some difficult decisions you'll have to make with all these facility needs that are competing and the parking, which, quite frankly, you know, the green space is far more important than the paved space, and the building space is preeminent.
All of which convinces me, Superintendent, that we're not quite ready at a point to issue a feasibility study based on what you have here. By virtue of everything you've just said with respect to other things that need to be worked on, until we have some idea of whether those outcomes have promise, potential, or not, there are people in this room that believe ensuring that we have WMATA and the Grad Center and Fairfax at the table and working with us, as well as potential high-value off-takers for the commercial. The school, in and of itself, once we do this feasibility study, we will need another one once those plans have been finalized. I believe that having those other actors involved doesn't complicate our approach, and in fact decomplicates our approach. And those meetings are yet to be had.
Those meetings are going to be coincidental with the feasibility study, so that I think those two efforts are going to line up nicely. I would submit to the council that, when the campus working group laid out this requirement for the parking, they did it to force us to confront the issue. It's going to stand out like a sore thumb. And it's been, as we've gone through this whole process, we've said, oh, well, we'll just deal with parking later. This is going to force us to deal with it. And it,
City manager, I'll charge you $5.60 to give you that issue.
so it's, well, here's one thing, you know, if you just measure out how much that space that takes, it's not a hard thing to do. So they will do that. That's the constraint that they've been given to do it. Then the policy questions will be up to us. How are we going to solve for it? So there are different ways it can be solved for. We've got the discussions with their adjacencies. That's one way. The policy questions of just not letting or cutting back on the parking, that's another. Structured or shared with the commercial development, that's another. But this feasibility study will set that up so that those decisions can be easier to make. And I'd also submit that in terms of the conceptual planning, the parking is pretty easy to carve off and set it aside. Once you've seen it and you see that it's a big problem, the complicated work is getting the school program, the building program, and the playing field program, getting that all laid out in a way that's feasible, and get good cost estimates for it. The parking, the way that it was set up in the RFP, I think really was aligned with what your thinking is. It was to set it up in a way that it has to be confronted as a policy question.
Other comments? I wonder, I mean, to me, and looking at this section, it says basically each plan is going to contemplate 400 surface parking spaces, right? That's how I read this last paragraph. Am I reading it correctly? Essentially, every scenario will show 400 surface parking spaces. Is that right?
Yeah, there's two scenarios that are called for, and so for both, so you're not comparing apples to oranges, you know, kept that parking problem as a consistent problem that has to be.
So, I mean, I'm just wondering, basically what you're saying to the architect is you have maybe 4 acres or whatever. I don't know how many 400 parking spaces, someone may know better than I would. Let's just say 4 acres off the table, right? If you're going to do surface parking, you can't put a building on those 4 acres. And so your site is essentially shrinking by, I'm just throwing out 4 acres as the number. But that's sort of what you're telling the architect. Because when you say you gotta have 400 surface parking spaces, you're telling him carve up whatever land that takes, and I'm just gonna throw out 4 acres. Yeah, go ahead.
So this feasibility study is related to the RFP that has already been issued and has already been procured.
Yeah,
But we will follow on the printed pieces of paper here with exactly these conversations with the architect to clarify what we're asking for. So they're not just looking at this and saying, all right, we'll just stick those 4 acres over there. They're looking at this and then they're coming back and asking the working group and others, so what do you guys want here, really? And that's the part. And they'd like to meet with city council. They'd like to meet with everyone to get that, to have this conversation with the architect, to make sure that they understand what we're asking for. So they're not just going to look at this and give us a high school. They have a lot more work that they're doing.
Mr. Mayor, if I might,
Mr. Snyder?
just a question for clarification, and I thought I got it. Can we get out of this work? Now, I know it says that the plan will provide 400 surface parking spaces. Can we sort of expand that to say, okay, if you didn't have those 400 spaces, what could you do, and how much land would you need? Can that be part of this? Dr. Schiller?
Sure, that is implied. It may not be stated there, but in all of our conversations, it's very clear that these are the asks, the what would be desired. The same thing as the program, what would be desired under best of circumstances. The reality is you're not going to be able to put on that acreage the building, the green space, the tennis courts, and all the fields that we want, and parking. The feasibility study, I think, will come back and put in bold relief, you can't have it all. These are the priorities that you are setting with the school board. This is what is affordable. This is what can fit. But they're not going to make the policy decisions, you all are, and the school board, of having to make the hard decisions. What if? What if we don't have the parking? But we can have the tennis courts, we can have the green field, and we can have the facility and the 10 acres or 8 acres or whatever it would be. The hard work is going to be after the feasibility study is completed. It dovetails into your economic development study. And meanwhile, you're exploring other options of related land for perhaps parking use. All of that will come together for you all to have to make, with the school board, some very difficult decisions in the months of June and July. And what will come out of that is going to be a diminishing of expectations. It could very well, one of the things that we liked about this Perkins Eastman proposal is they have what's known as a master scheduler who will also put together, what if we did not build a building that accommodated one classroom per teacher? How much square footage could be reduced if indeed, like all other school districts, you maximize the use of every classroom for every period? You may be able to get away with less square feet, but a more fully maximized building for less cost. So there are a lot of things that are going to be looked at here. There are a lot of moving pieces. And as Ms. Hardy and Ms. Connolly and Mr. Shields will attest, that the upcoming meetings are not just with the work group to flesh these things out and look at options, but also we've planned in there meetings with the school board and with you, with the Perkins Eastman, so they can hear directly and also bring to you and explain to you the options that they've come up with and the scenarios and the limitations. So this is, this is an organic process that I think compressed into time is going to force the city and the school board to make to grapple with some very difficult policy decisions and to grapple with some very difficult priorities. Get what you need at the right affordable price. There's no assumption that there's going to be room for a swimming pool or room for 400 spaces. There's no ongoing assumption that there's going to be room for anything. It's an empty blank sheet that we've given to them. We spent several hours the other day walking through the building, and the principal's been giving them every bit of information, even today, the master schedule, which I approved for next year. Had to make difficult decisions there about not allowing very small class sizes for next year. We can't afford it. We haven't done that in a number of years to look at it that way. So I have faith that you're going to be able to, with the school board, have before you these different options and the cost factors, and that's where the real work's going to take place in June, when you get this information and everything then feeds into it.
So if I could just clarify, we use this request for proposal to get proposals. We've selected a firm, and the action before us tonight is only to issue the contract to the firm or not. If we don't like the proposal that was developed some months ago, it's a little bit late to do that. And in order to not move forward, if we decide not to move forward on the contract because we don't like the original RFP, then we are definitely going to slow down the whole process. So what I'm hearing you and Ms. Connolly and Mr. Shields say is that we're going to have a dialogue while this study is going on that will allow us to address those issues or tee up those issues. So I think the important thing right now is, are we prepared to go forward with the contract or not? That's the question.
Yeah, and maybe I didn't state it forcefully enough. I don't think the goal is to have 400 surface parking spaces at the end of the day. What it is that is the program. That's what the school has said they need. Now we're going to lay it out there and see how that works or doesn't work, and then go explore the other options.
Well, there are other things as well, but I won't bring them up tonight. But if in fact that's how you're laying out that this will devolve in time, and we as stakeholders would have some input into the final outcome, and I'm somewhat skeptical about that, but
Feasibility study, trying to determine what is feasible. I think these are not the designs, it's not the RFP, it's what is feasible. 6 months that I've been here, we've talked about a lot of things that a lot of people would like to see. Now we're down to the granular, what is feasible and affordable.
I think the concern some of us have is that it looks like one of your presumption is that we need to have 400 parking spaces, and I think the concern would be, well, maybe some things that we would like to see will not be there because we have a prerequisite that you have to have 400 parking spaces. That's how this reads to me. And so I understand what you've said, and I'm fine with what you've said.
Yes.
When I look at this paper,
I understand.
I hear something different than what's coming out of your mouth. And
Well, I think, you know, what we're driving as a process is to determine, after all these months of conversation and all of the interests, you know, of a field house, of a pool, of new gymnasiums, what is feasible and affordable? That's what's going to come down to your final decisions. What is affordable and what it is that we want there? And what is most importantly that, you know, after all these months that we would meet together as a board and as a council, and we were talking about these, I think there were at one point 14 different options, it does come down to now, what is really feasible and what is it going to cost? That's what I think you'll learn through this process. And then decide if you can go forward and when to go forward with an RFP.
speaking of what does it cost, is this contract a fixed price contract, or will they go to meeting after meeting with the price will end up with, be substantially higher?
Is it fixed cost lump sum, or is it?
Yes, it's a fixed cost contract.
So that when they come to additional meetings where you bring them out
No,
here to
it's
talk
all
to us, we're not going to
included in
get
the contract.
a bill that's twice as much?
No, it's all
$300
included in
an
a contract. In fact, I canceled a meeting for this Thursday so that we could have one where I thought was more importantly when Wyatt and I were talking down the road with you.
Okay. Any other questions?
I do, Mr. Mayor. Mr. City Manager, this is money that's coming out of the reserve, and my understanding is that's a reserve from the water system sale.
That's correct.
Any other comments, questions?
Well, I have a high degree of confidence and respect in both the city manager as well as our interim superintendent. So these are people of their word, and I intend to hold them to it.
Okay, is there any action required on this?
So the requested action actually is not to approve the contract itself, because the school board is the executor of this contract, but to authorize the use of the reserve of the campus planning funds for this purpose, because our tradition has been that you can only draw on those funds with the consent of both boards. And so that is the request tonight, and that's what the motion would do.
Okay. Is there anyone in the public who wishes to address this matter? Seeing none, the matter is closed to the public. Do we have a motion?
I move to authorize the use of campus planning funds for a contract with Perkins Eastman for the school feasibility study in the amount of $56,000.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Motion needs to change.
It should have been $56,580.
$56,580.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All right, Madam Clerk?
Was that Ms. Oliver on the second?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I
Yes,
was
it was.
correcting that. Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Hardy?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
Yes.
Mayor Tarter?
Yes?
Motion carries 7-0.
Okay, business not on the agenda. Any business not on the agenda? Any standing or regional committee and council liaison reports? Are there any council member comments? There is a...
Just one quick one. On Wednesday, the subgroup at NVTC is meeting to work through Metro funding issues. So we're very much engaged, and the message is clear from the budget discussion tonight. We have to collectively need to find a different funding source other than local government.
Okay, any council member comments? Yes.
Ask a scheduling question. Where did we end up on the Economic Development Committee meeting on Thursday? Is anyone actually able to attend it at all? Okay, and you will not, because you all are meeting in another place.
Monday morning?
That's canceled now.
Oh, the campus working group, that meeting's canceled. Okay.
Okay, that was what I thought conflicted, so that doesn't conflict anymore. So are we meeting at 9 o'clock, or you're not meeting, but 9 o'clock? Okay, so just let the EDO staff know, right?
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Government Operations Committee meets tomorrow at noon, and the IT department will be presenting.
Okay, any other council member comments? Let's go to the minutes of May 9th, 2016. I know everyone remembers exactly what happened then. Any comments or changes to the minutes of May 9th, 2016? If not, do we have any?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
just to the clerk on lines 314 and 340, I think it is. I think closed is the word you want, not close. Maybe do a search, find, change.
Read these things, don't you, man?
Had a lot of time.
I'm glad somebody reads them. Besides me. 314. I see it. Okay, yep.
And 342, I think. Yeah,
I will do a search and fix all of those. Thank you very much.
So with that, Mr. Mayor, I move to approve the minutes of the May 9th, 2016 meeting as corrected.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All right, why don't we just do a roll call? I know we probably could do it by voice vote, but go ahead and do it.
Okay. Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Hardy?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
Yes.
And Mayor Tarter?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Is there anything else that anyone would like to say? Okay,
Move to adjourn.
let's do it.